In the remote forest of Montana, 72-year-old Margaret Thorne's life takes an extraordinary turn when she rescues 4 orphaned bear cubs. 4 years later, the bears return as adults and do something totally unexpected. The piercing scream shattered the tranquil Montana morning, echoing through the dense pine forest surrounding Margaret Thorne's isolated cabin. The 72-year-old woman's arthritic hands trembled as she dropped her morning tea, the delicate china shattering on the weathered porch boards. Her heart raced as she squinted into the misty dawn, trying to locate the source of the commotion. What Margaret saw next made her blood run cold. 4 massive black bears were charging across her front yard, their powerful bodies moving at an astonishing speed. But they weren't fleeing from something. They were running straight towards her porch. Margaret's mind reeled. In all her years living on the edge of the wilderness, she'd never seen bears behave like this. As the bears drew closer, Margaret's survival instincts finally kicked in. She turned to flee into the safety of her cabin, but her cane caught on a loose floorboard. She stumbled, crying out in pain as her hips slammed against the porch railing. Helpless and terrified, Margaret could only watch as the bears closed in. The largest one, a male with distinctive reddish-tinged fur, reached the porch first. It reared up on its hind legs, easily 7 feet tall, and let out a thunderous roar. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, certain that these were her final moments, but the killing blow never came. Instead, she felt something entirely unexpected. A gentle, warm pressure against her outstretched hand. Margaret's eyes flew open in disbelief. The massive bear didn't attack her. It was nuzzling her palm. As Margaret stared in wide-eyed shock, recognition slowly dawned. That reddish fur, those intelligent eyes. It couldn't be Rusty, she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. The bear huffed softly, a sound so achingly familiar that it brought tears to Margaret's eyes. As the other 3 bears crowded onto the porch, each displaying the same inexplicable gentleness, Margaret felt her world tilt on its axis. "My God," she breathed, "you've come back, all of you." In that surreal moment, as 4 full-grown black bears surrounded her with unmistakable affection, Margaret Thorne realized that the most extraordinary chapter of her life was only just beginning. 4 years earlier, her life had been far less eventful. At 68, she'd settled into a quiet routine in her remote cabin, finding solace in nature after the loss of her husband. That autumn morning had started like any other, until a faint cry caught her attention. As she collected her mail, following the sound, Margaret discovered 4 tiny bear cubs huddled beneath a fallen log at the edge of her property. Their mother was nowhere in sight, and the cubs were weak, barely clinging to life. Margaret knew the dangers of interfering with wildlife, but as she gazed at those helpless creatures, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. With a deep breath, she made a decision that would change everything. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's cabin transformed into a makeshift nursery. She named the cubs Rusty, Midnight, Honey, and Pause, each with distinct personalities that quickly endeared them to her. She spent sleepless nights bottle feeding and attending to their every need. Margaret knew she couldn't keep them forever, but she was determined to give them fighting chance at survival. As the cubs grew stronger, Margaret reached out to the wildlife authorities. The day they brought the bears to a rehabilitation center was one of the hardest of her life. Watching the transport truck drive away, Margaret felt a profound sense of loss, tempered only by the hope that she'd given the cubs a second chance at life in the wild. In the years that followed, Margaret threw herself into wildlife conservation efforts. She gave lectures at schools, volunteered at animal shelters, and wrote passionate articles about coexisting with nature. But she never forgot her 4 little cubs, often wondering about their fate. Now, 4 years later, Margaret found herself in a situation that defied belief. 4 adult black bears, she was convinced were her rescued cubs, had returned, displaying behavior that flew in the face of everything she thought she knew about wild animals. As the initial shock wore off, Margaret's scientific curiosity took over. She observed the bears closely, noting how they interacted with her and their surroundings. Their behavior was extraordinary. They seemed to remember the layout of her cabin, investigating familiar spots with noticeable excitement. Rusty, the largest, kept close to Margaret, occasionally bumping his massive head against her hand in a gesture reminiscent of his cub days. Midnight, still the most reserved, kept watch over the edge of the porch. Honey busied herself exploring the flower pots, while Paws, true to his name, left muddy paw prints all over the porch as he enthusiastically greeted his former caretaker. Margaret's mind raced with questions. After all this time, how had they found her? How could they possibly remember her? And, most importantly, what should she do now? As much as her heart soared at this unexpected reunion, Margaret knew the situation was fraught with danger. These were wild animals capable of causing serious harm, no matter their shared history. If word got out about bears frequenting her property, it could lead to them being deemed a threat and potentially euthanized. With a heavy heart, Margaret realized she needed to encourage the bears to leave. "I'm so happy to see you," she said softly, addressing all 4 bears. "But you can't stay here, my darlings. This isn't your home anymore." As if understanding her words, Rusty lowered himself back to all 4s and made a low, mournful sound. The other bears shifted restlessly, their eyes never leaving Margaret. Slowly and cautiously, Margaret made her way to the edge of the porch. As she reached up and unhooked a bird feeder from the eaves, the bears watched intently. With deliberate movements, she walked to the tree line and hung the feeder on a low branch. "There you go," she said, fighting back tears. "A little roadside snack. But then you need to go back to the forest where you belong." For a long moment none of the bears moved. They looked at Margaret first, then at the bird feeder, and then back at her. Margaret held her breath, unsure of what would happen next. Then something truly astonishing occurred. Rusty lumbered over to the bird feeder, rose up on his hind legs, and with surprising dexterity unhooked it from the branch. Margaret watched in disbelief as the massive bear carried the feeder back toward the porch. But Rusty didn't stop there. To Margaret's utter amazement, the bear began methodically dismantling the feeder. His powerful claws made quick work of the plastic and metal components. The other bears gathered around, watching intently as Margaret watched breaking the feeder for fun or food. They were salvaging parts. Her suspicion was confirmed moments later when Honey picked up a long metal rod from the deconstructed feeder. With careful movements, the bear maneuvered the rod toward a high branch of a nearby oak tree. It took several attempts, but eventually Honey managed to knock loose a bee's nest that had been tucked away in the foliage. The nest fell to the ground, breaking open on impact, as bees swarmed angrily around the area. The bears waited patiently at a safe distance. Once the insects dispersed, they moved in to enjoy the honeycomb. Margaret could scarcely believe her eyes. The bears had used a tool, a concept she'd only ever associated with primates and a few bird species. They'd not only remembered her, but had apparently developed problem-solving skills far beyond what she thought possible for their species. As she watched the bears share their prize, Margaret's scientific mind went into overdrive. This wasn't just an extraordinary reunion, it was potentially groundbreaking for our understanding of bear intelligence and behavior. But even as excitement coursed through her, Margaret felt a stab of fear. With this level of reasoning, what else could bears do? And how could she possibly keep them safe in a world that often views wildlife as a nuisance at best and a threat at worst? Her musings were interrupted by a new sound, one that made her blood run cold. She could hear the distinctive rumble of approaching vehicles. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the sound. It was Hank Granger's old pickup truck, likely accompanied by some of the other local hunters. One of her neighbors must have heard about the bear sightings. Panic seized her. If the hunters found the bears here, showing such unusual behavior, there was no telling what might happen. She had to act fast. "You need to go," she urged the bears, her voice tight with fear now. But the bears, still focused on their honeycomb feast, didn't seem to grasp the urgency of the situation. Margaret's mind raced. How could she convince them to flee to safety? In a moment of desperate inspiration, the old woman hobbled back into her cabin. She emerged moments later with an old air horn, a relic from her husband's boating days. With a silent prayer, she raised the horn and pressed the button. The blast was deafening in the quiet morning air. The bears jerked to attention, startled by the sudden noise. Margaret's heart broke as she saw fear replace the trust in their eyes, but she knew it was necessary. "Go!" she shouted, waving her arms. "Get out of here!" This time the bears responded. They lumbered toward the tree line with surprising speed for creatures their size. Rusty, the last to leave, paused at the sight of the forest and turned back, meeting Margaret's gaze one last time. At that moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even gratitude, in those deep brown eyes. Then, in a flash of reddish fur, he was gone. Margaret barely had time to catch her breath before Hank's truck came into view, kicking up dust as it rumbled down her long driveway. 3 more vehicles followed close behind. Hank, a burly man in his 50s with a bushy beard and ever-present camouflage cap, was the first to leap out. His rifle was already in his hands as he scanned the area. "Margaret!" he called out. "You all right?" "We heard there were bears." Margaret straightened herself, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to face down the hunting party. "Everything's fine, Hank," she said, injecting her voice with a calm she didn't quite feel. "There were some bears, but they've moved on. No need for all this fuss." Hank frowned, clearly disappointed at missing out on the excitement. "You sure? Bill said he saw 4 of them heading this way. Big ones, too." "Oh, I'm quite sure," Margaret replied firmly. "You know how rumors get exaggerated. There was only one bear, and it was more scared of me than I was of it. It ran off as soon as it saw me." She could see the doubt in Hank's eyes, but years of living in the community had earned Margaret a reputation for level-headedness. After a few more questions and a cursory look around her property, Hank and his companions reluctantly packed up their gear and headed home. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Margaret sank onto her porch steps, her legs suddenly weak with relief. She'd protected her bears, for now. But she knew this was only the beginning. The events of the morning had raised far more questions than they'd answered. How had the bears developed such advanced problem-solving skills? Why had they sought her out after all this time? And most pressingly, how could she ensure their safety in a world that might not understand or appreciate their extraordinary nature? As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Margaret Thorne realized that her quiet life on the edge of the wilderness would never be the same. The woman who had once saved 4 bear cubs now faced an even greater challenge, protecting 4 intelligent, remarkable adult bears while potentially revolutionizing our understanding of animal cognition. With a deep breath, Margaret stood up, her resolve strengthening. She had work to do, research to conduct, authorities to contact, and plans to make. The bears' return wasn't just a heartwarming reunion, it was the beginning of a scientific journey that could change everything. As she turned to go back into her cabin, Margaret paused. There, on the porch railing, sat a perfect pine cone. One that hadn't been there earlier. A smile tugged at her lips as she picked it up, running her fingers over its rough scales. "Well, my darlings," she murmured to the silent forest, "I suppose this means we'll be seeing each other again." And with that, Margaret Thorne stepped into her cabin, ready to embark on the most extraordinary adventure of her life, one that would challenge everything we thought we knew about intelligence in the emotional capacity of wild animals, and the profound connections that can form between species. In the days that followed the bear's extraordinary visit, Margaret threw herself into research. Her dining room table disappeared under stacks of scientific journals and wildlife biology textbooks. She reached out to old contacts in the scientific community, carefully framing her observations as hypothetical scenarios to avoid raising suspicion. But she knew that second-hand accounts and theoretical discussions wouldn't be enough. She needed proof. And so, with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, she set up a series of wildlife cameras around her property. For weeks, there was nothing. Margaret began to wonder if she had imagined the whole encounter, and if grief and loneliness had finally taken their toll on her aging mind. But then, on a chilly autumn morning, much like the one when she'd first found the cubs, her patience was rewarded. The cameras captured footage that would send shock waves through the scientific community. The bears had returned, and this time their behavior was even more astonishing. The video showed the bears engaging in complex problem-solving tasks. They used sticks to dig for grubs, a behavior occasionally observed in wild bears. But then they did something unprecedented. They modified their tools. Rusty was filmed carefully stripping bark from a branch to create a smoother digging implement. Honey discovered that by wedging a flat stone under a log, she could leverage it more easily to access the insects beneath. Most remarkably, the bears displayed clear evidence of cooperative problem-solving. In one video, Midnight and Paws worked together to move a heavy boulder, revealing a colony of ground squirrels beneath. Then they took turns guarding the hole while the other fed, demonstrating a level of coordination rarely seen outside of primates. Margaret watched the footage with a mixture of awe and concern. The bears' intelligence was far beyond anything previously documented in their species. But with this knowledge came a heavy responsibility. If this information was released before she could ensure the bears' safety, it could put them in grave danger. Driven by the need to understand and protect her unusual charges, Margaret made a decision. She contacted Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a renowned wildlife biologist, best known for her groundbreaking work on animal cognition. If anyone could help Margaret make sense of what she was seeing and help protect the bears, it was her. When Elena arrived at Margaret's cabin, a week later, She was skeptical. But it took only one viewing of the footage to convince her that something truly extraordinary was happening in this remote corner of Montana. "This is unprecedented," she murmured, her eyes wide as she watched Rusty fashion a crude spear from a sharp stick. "If this is genuine, it could revolutionize our understanding of human intelligence. Hell, it could completely change how we view animal cognition." Margaret nodded gravely. "That's why I called you, Elena. I need your help to study them and understand what's happening. But more importantly, I need your help to protect them." Over the next few months, Margaret's property became a covert research station. Elena brought in a small team of trusted colleagues, each signing ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They set up more sophisticated monitoring equipment and designed a series of experiments to test the bears' cognitive abilities. The results were staggering. The bears demonstrated tool use, problem-solving skills, and social cooperation far beyond anything previously observed in their species. They showed signs of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and even rudimentary symbolic communication with each other. As news of the discoveries began to be carefully disseminated through scientific circles, it sparked a revolution in how we view animal intelligence. Margaret found herself at the heart of a paradigm shift in human-animal relations. Years passed. Margaret, now in her late 70s, sat on her porch on a warm summer evening. Elena, who had grown to be both a colleague and a dear friend, sat beside her. They watched as the 4 bears, older now but still as remarkable as ever, foraged at the clearing edge. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Elena inquired, a note of wonder still present in her voice, even after all these years of study. Margaret chuckled softly. "Not in my wildest dreams. When I found those 4 little cubs, I just wanted to give them a chance at life. I never thought they'd come back and change everything." As if on cue, Rusty looked up from his foraging. His eyes met Margaret's across the clearing. In that gaze was an intelligence and a depth of connection that never failed to take Margaret's breath away. The old woman who saved 4 bear cubs had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape our understanding of the animal kingdom. But more than that, she had forged a connection between species that hinted at new possibilities for coexistence and mutual understanding. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter with wildlife that changed your perspective? Would you have the courage to care for abandoned bear cubs like Margaret did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey, and stay tuned for more incredible stories like this.